Hey everyone, my name is Lucas Hall. I'm here with Cozy and Landlordology, and we have an amazing event planned for you tonight. So we're actually going to talk about renters insurance. This will be the landlord's guide to renters insurance. So specifically, we're going to be talking to landlords. I know that we have some people here who are not landlords, and you're a tenant, or you're hoping to be a landlord, or maybe not. Maybe you just love being a renter. That's fine. We're going to talk about all aspects of it, but specifically, we're going to get into the weeds about what it means for landlords, because most people know that renters insurance is something for renters, but there are a lot of benefits for landlords and how why you should require it and such. So we're going to dive right in. Who am I? Why are you here? How did you learn about me or this webinar? I am Lucas Hall. I am the head of industry relations at Cozy. I have been a landlord for almost 11 years, and I have properties in 3 different states. I have anywhere from 18 to 20 tenants at any given time, and I also founded a website called Landlordology. That's how I know a lot of you. Actually, I recognize a lot of names on the attendee list here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your support over the years. Landlordology is a fantastic free education site that teaches you how to be a landlord. It teaches you everything you need to know, and then it shows you what tools are available to run it yourself, and so you can save a lot of money, by doing it yourself. So check that out if you haven't. Next, we have Nicole Dee. Nicole is a national account executive at Assurant, which you'll learn more about Assurant as a company as we go through this presentation. But she's also a licensed insurance agent, and she is joining us on the phone from Florida. Missed the damage from the last hurricane. So Nicole, say hi.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. She has been key to our partnership with Assurant, and we'll get into that in a little bit. She has just been so wonderful to work with, and we're excited to have her because her expertise in the insurance industry is vast and goes far. So. Next, we have Maggie Cooper, who is the head of customer success here at Cozy. If any of you have signed up for Cozy over the last year and a half or so, you've probably gotten an email from Maggie right off the bat just saying welcome and is there anything I can do to help. She has essentially catered to our customers for the better part of the last year and a half, and she's been doing a great job. So she's also a Portlander and has 2 rental units that she's using Cozy for to manage herself. So Maggie, say hi.
Hi everyone. I will be helping out with questions today. So I will be reading your questions as they come in, and then at the end of the session, Lucas will be doing a Q&A. So type in your questions, and we'd love to interact with you today. Thanks everyone.
All right, so that's the crew. We are your hosts tonight. And again, this is sponsored by Cozy, which we provide modern property management software for landlords and renters. We're essentially making a difference and changing the industry and how it works. So we went out and decided to try to democratize tools that were typically only available to very large and very profitable property management companies, and make them available to small independent landlords who didn't have thousands of dollars a month to throw at it. So let me tell you what we do. So Cozy does a variety of things, but there's 3 core features or elements that we really do very, very well. One is we help you list and market your property, so you can actually create a beautiful listing and get it out there and syndicate it and then share it with whoever you want using a URL, and then it gives you beautiful pictures and even an online rental application that comes with it. So your applicants, once they find your place through that listing, they can apply right online, and then if you require it or if you want it to be required, they actually have to buy a credit report and a background check to go with that application, so it's nice and neat and bundled together. And that way, when you get really the first exposure of that applicant who's officially applying, you have everything you need to look at it right there, and it's all bundled together. And then once you find somebody that you actually love and fits your criteria, then you can roll them right into online rent collection. And so you basically set up the lease terms that you have, and then tell us about how much is the rent, the deposit, the move-in fees, whatever you're charging, and we will orchestrate that process. And the best part about it is that it is 100% free for you. So we don't charge for rent collection, we don't charge transaction fees for that, for bank-to-bank transfers, and we process nearly $1 billion in rent every single year. It is not free for your landlords. The rent collection is free, but if they buy a credit report or background check to share with you as part of that application, then they do have to pay for that, and that's only about $39. So, and they get a copy too, so it's great. But what we do most recently, we launched a product called Cozy Renters Insurance, and we partnered with this company called Assurant, who is a national company. I'll tell you more about it, but they have just been doing things really well for a very long time and have a huge presence. And we were talking with them, and this came up and said, well, our landlords really would love to be able to track and offer renters insurance to their tenants and make it really easy for those tenants to get renters insurance. So how do we make this happen? And this product came out of it. So we're going to walk you through that in a little bit and tell you more about, generally speaking, what is renters insurance and why you need it, and why you should encourage, if not enforce, your tenants to have it. So let's dive right in. What is renters insurance? Well, first and foremost, it is not a policy that you as a landlord or you as a homeowner would even need to buy or worry about yourself. It is something that a tenant opts in for, a tenant purchases, and typically every big insurance company has some sort of renters insurance program. A lot of times they bundle it with auto policies or whatnot, but it might not be that good of a deal if you do that. But there are two types of coverage within each renter's insurance policy, and so it all kind of boils down to these two elements. One is personal property, and the other is liability. So for those of you who have been a landlord for a while, or you even have renter's insurance as a tenant, this isn't new, but here's the foundation, the basics: personal property and liability coverage. So let's dive into what those are and really what's covered and what's not. So what is personal property coverage? First and foremost, when I think of personal property coverage, I think of stuff, right? Belongings, things that I own, things that are not of incredible value, like a vehicle or a boat. That's not going to be typically covered under a renter's insurance policy, but I do think of laptops, cell phones, tablets, like if you're like me, and I have a daughter, a 5-year-old daughter, and she's got more tablets than I do. It's just because you can get them on Amazon and buy a Kindle Fire for like $60. But all that is personal property. And for me, my laptop, my MacBook, is probably one of the more expensive things in my house. And if I were to have there was a fire or water damage or a burglary or something, that's probably what would get lost or damaged. A lot of times during burglaries, they just break in, grab whatever they can, and usually that means small, expensive devices, and then they leave so that they won't get caught. So certainly renter's insurance covers personal property, including laptops, phones, tablets, and all the other really expensive electronic devices. 2, covers bikes. Now, I'll tell you a quick story. I actually had a tenant who in Washington, D.C., where I have some rental properties, there's not a lot of spaces for cars, and so a lot of people just bike around. It's a primary form of transportation, so there are bikes everywhere. And I had one tenant who would lock her bike up in the back of the house, and someone went around the side and went to the back and cut the chain with cable cutters in the middle of the night and just walked out with the bike. And she came to me and she said, someone trespassed on the property and stole my bike. What are you going to do about it? I calmly just said, I'm so sorry. It's not my fault. I didn't steal it, and it's not my responsibility to replace your bike. Did you have renter's insurance? And she said no, she didn't. She didn't even think about it. And I said, well, it is required in your lease. And she's like, yeah, I know. I just never bothered with it. And so as a result, she ended up losing a bike. Now, that could have been prevented. In this case, here's Pee Wee Herman, who, if you remember Pee-wee's Big Adventure, that was a huge movie when I was younger, and I loved it. I watched it like 1,000 times. And in the movie, he loses his bike, gets stolen, and he goes on this big adventure to try to get it back. And if he had had renter's insurance, he wouldn't have had to go through that whole drama of getting it back. And now it was a big adventure and it was fun, but it was really about theft. Moving on, your furniture is covered. So now this is a joke, right? Okay, so if any of you out there are fans of Game of Thrones, here's the Iron Throne, right? So this is actually the real thing. This is in the studio, and if you look to the right there, you'll see Queen Elizabeth. So I guess sometime last year she took a visit to the set, and she's looking around, and one of the producers came up and asked her, Your Majesty, would you like to sit in the chair? And she just politely said, no, thank you. I found out later that it's actually against esoteric law for a queen to sit on a foreign throne. But she just politely declined, and I think that's hilarious because there she is, right? She's the actual monarchy. So, but the point is, renter's insurance will cover things like furniture. So, when I got married, we bought like a $1,200 leather couch. Like, it was awesome, right? First leather couch I ever had, and we still have that to this day. But I don't want to have to replace it on my own. It was kind of expensive if something were to happen. So renter's insurance covers that. A lot of times there's like family heirlooms or family wardrobes or chests or something that have been passed down from generation to generation. As long as it doesn't have some type of artwork policy or it's multiple thousands of dollars, there are coverage limits, but generally speaking, most furniture is going to be covered. It's plain and simple. Now, if you like clothing and you have a lot of clothing, especially expensive clothing, like Barney here. Barney is from How I Met Your Mother. I love that show. And Barney wears nothing but suits, right? He is a suit fanatic, and he's always talking about how I need to go suit up. Well, here you go, and here are all the suits. And if you're like Barney and there's a fire in the place and you lose everything, it would really be a good idea to have renter's insurance, because then that would cover your clothes. Now, there are limitations to all these things, but generally speaking, it's pretty generous. So, most people won't think about that, but clothes, especially if you're Barney, probably cost $10,000 to $20,000. So, another common thing that gets covered is like small appliances. And so, if you're anything like me, you probably bought or were pressured into buying that limited edition mixer from Williams-Sonoma that cost 3 times as much because it was a different color. Because that's what you had to register for on your wedding registry. But we ended up selling that years later, and we actually made a good amount of money on it. So, but that type of stuff would be covered. Hooray, right? So if, excuse me, I am struggling here. It's getting hot. It is still daytime here in Portland, Oregon, and the sun is blasting through the windows. But moving on. Personal property coverage. So let's get into exactly why or how something could get damaged and what would be covered in that. So it's kind of the why. So, for example, if you lose your TV or your laptops or your clothes or your mixer or whatever to fire or lightning, windstorm or hail, explosions, unfortunately, vandalism or mischief, which that's very common, smoke, theft, and then accidental water damage or steam damage. Now, I think most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but don't underestimate the damage that water can cause and smoke can cause, right? I mean, a lot of places, everyone understands theft and vandalism and all that, but like smoke, not so much. I mean, smoke really damages everything it touches. It's hard to get that smoky smell out. If there's a kitchen fire in an apartment like 3 doors down, you're likely going to get all of that smoke. So that's going to damage all of your fabrics. Accidental water or steam damage, that is common when a pipe busts or when there's flooding. And now I shouldn't say flooding is covered, but if you have something that is damaged through like a pipe burst, like I said that. But mainly also through like radiators. So in DC, we have a lot of steam radiators, and if one of those steam radiators busts and damages an entire wall, right, then that's going to damage all the bookshelf or the books in the bookshelf and all the TVs and appliances and stuff that's all on that wall. So you just got to be careful. So these are things that are typically acceptable sources of damage, and then insurance will kick in if one of these things happens. So moving on, what is a landlord responsibility to personal property coverage? Now, in order for you as a landlord to not be responsible for their giant big screen TV if something were to happen, you have to provide a minimum level of security. Now, what does that really mean, right? Well, for one, you have to provide actual locking doors and locking windows. So if you have a window that's just, it doesn't ever lock, it maybe doesn't even close, one, you might not even be providing a place that's considered inhabitable, but two, if somebody were to break in or open the window and go in and then steal everything, you could be on the hook for that because you didn't provide a minimum level of security. So make sure that everything locks really well, and then if they don't choose to use that deadbolt, that's a different story. But make sure it has the ability to be safe and secure. And then two, limited access. So I know landlords who give a key to their rental unit to every contractor that they've ever met, right? Because they're like, I never know who I'm going to call, or I never know who I'm going to need to go over there and check something out. Well, now you have like 20 people who have basically unrestricted access to that rental unit. And if they've got it sitting on their dresser at home and then their Uncle Bob comes to stay with them for a while and figures it out and takes that key and then, you know, robs the place. So you have to make sure that, generally speaking, the tenants and then a very restricted few who you trust and can document have access to that property. So change the locks as much as you can, or as much as, you know, every time a tenant comes in and out, and make sure it's restricted. And then two, your insurance, and this is really important, your insurance, whether that's a condo policy like an HO6 policy that you have, or you're just like your fire policy, your damage policy on the rental property itself, that insurance policy will not cover their belongings. So the tenant's stuff is their stuff. They need to take care of it. If you burn the whole house down, or if, let's just say the furnace blows up and it burns the house down, and they get out but they leave all their stuff in, they're out of luck, right? Like their stuff isn't going to be covered. Your stuff will be covered if you have a couple of furniture pieces or appliances in, that'll be covered, but not their stuff. So it's critical for you to make sure that they understand that. Otherwise, you'll get a situation like where my tenant came to me and said, my bike was stolen, it's your fault because, you know, it was in your backyard, and I need you to reimburse me. If they have renter's insurance, then it's not a big deal, right? It's just kind of like, okay, well, they'll file a claim and get a new bike. It's that easy. Loss of use. So let's talk about that real quick. Usually, everyone knows what this is when you're talking about, you know, a landlord's policy, right? Like, it's like, oh, if there's fire damage and I can't rent the place out, I get compensated for the loss of use. Like I get the rental income, fair market value of the rental income. Well, with a renter's policy, that doesn't make any sense. So what does that really mean? So loss of use for a renter's policy is, is that if there is a fire and the place is considered uninhabitable, right, then the tenant has this insurance policy that they can go and they say, I need to go stay in a hotel because my place is busted and I need help. And the insurance policy will kick in and help them, you know, go stay somewhere else because they lost the use of their rental property. Now, you as a landlord, you do have a responsibility to ensure a habitable dwelling. So you know, if your place burns down, even if it wasn't your fault, you're still kind of on the hook for that. You're still on the hook for ensuring that the place is inhabitable. If you want them to pay rent, right? If you are not going to provide a habitable dwelling, then they don't really owe you any money. That's the very basic landlord-tenant relationship. But if you want them to continue to pay rent, then you have to give them a habitable dwelling in return. And so commonly a landlord, you know, will pay for temporary housing, like a hotel or a suite or something. If it was the tenant's liability or tenant's responsibility because they caught the kitchen on fire or because they did something negligently, then the tenant's policy will kick in too and help. So you know, there's a little bit of wiggle room there on who gets to pay for what, but I think it's important for the tenant to know that they have that. So moving on, remember I mentioned there was personal property, now there's liability coverage. What does that mean for a tenant? So examples, and this is the best way I can think of to really describe liability, instead of giving you a lot of legalese, let's just talk about real life scenarios. One is you overflow the bathtub or overflow the sink and the water, you know, as a tenant, the water spills out, like damages all your floor and then goes down to the unit below. That's a pretty big liability example. It means the tenant is liable for the damage. Now, I'll tell you a quick story. I had a friend who who had a tenant who fell asleep in the bathtub, right? Scary. She was drinking a little too much wine, fell asleep. Luckily, she didn't drown herself, but she did leave the water on and somehow had like clogged up the drain. So of course the water overflowed. It really did damage about $15,000 worth of Brazilian hardwood cherry floors, and then went through the wall and then down into the unit below. And my friend, who was a landlord, ended up saying, telling me that she was getting nasty calls from the unit owner below, and it was just a big deal. And the tenant did have renter's insurance, and sure enough, the renter's insurance covered everything. They covered the damage to the hardwoods, they covered the damage to the entire unit below, because the tenant was completely responsible. That was just it was a mistake, but she was completely responsible for it. So that's a great example. If she didn't have renter's insurance, then your landlord policy, right, your building policy or your damage policy as an owner would kick in and repair your floors. But then they would probably sue the tenant. The insurance company might go after that tenant because it was their liability. So let's say they're mowing the grass and they drive it into a fence. Could be your fence, could be the neighbor's fence. Doesn't really matter, but they damage something, right? Then they're liable for that. The renter's insurance would kick in. A lot of times, cigarettes are gonna, they're smoking on the porch, and then it's a wooden porch, and they accidentally drop a cigarette, and it slips between the cracks where all the dried leaves are, and next thing you know, you have a porch fire that turns into a house fire, and then turns into a complete teardown. So cigarette fires, grill fires, propane tank explosions, those are actually more common than you think, and I'm sure Nicole can probably give you some numbers on how often that happens, especially in July and August. But number 4, we always think of the little kid playing baseball with his dad, and then all of a sudden hits this grand slam and it hits a window in the neighbor's yard. Well, that happens, but more often than not, like, kids are just playing, or parents are throwing stuff around, and it just damages something. That happens a lot, and so that kind of stuff, that the other's house will actually get paid for by the tenant's policy, which is great because that leaves you out of it as a homeowner. And it'll also cover medical injury to guests. Now, this is really important because a tenant, it's expected of the tenant to have their own medical policy, right? Their own medical insurance. But if they have a guest over and that guest slips and falls or trips over a big pile of clothes that they leave in the living room and breaks their arm, right? The tenant's insurance policy will actually kick in to help with that. Now, a lot of times that guest also has medical insurance, and that medical insurance just takes care of it. But if they didn't, or they didn't want to file it, I suppose the tenant's policy would kick in and help with that. It is not for the tenant themselves. So it is not something the tenant can say, I broke my arm because I tripped over my own pile of clothes, and expect the policy to get cover. This is actually really an important bullet. I want to say that you as a homeowner, one of the scariest things for me, where I think I might get sued in the future, right, is where somebody slips and falls on something on my property and then just decides, oh, he's a landlord, he must have a lot of money, and I'm going to sue him because of it, right? And so if they have tenants insurance, this might kick in and kind of reduce the risk of you getting sued. And then lastly, dog bites to strangers. That is something that that happens quite a bit, and they always think about the mailman getting bit, but it's a lot more than that. I mean, dogs get spooked just like anybody else, or maybe they bite other dogs or other animals. And if they kill the neighbor's cat, if a dog kills the neighbor's cat, that neighbor's going to be pissed, and you don't want, excuse my language, doesn't want to deal with the tenant. They want to deal with the homeowner, but you can say, well, listen, the tenant's policy will cover damages like that. All right, moving on. Why does renter's insurance actually matter to the landlord? So I think this is critical. So we talked about how it benefits or what it covers for tenants, but let's talk about what it covers for landlords themselves. So here's some really great statistics. These kind of put things into perspective, why it's important for you as a landlord to make sure that your tenants have renter's insurance. Number one, 49% of all Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Now, this is an odd picture of people arm wrestling, but it's supposed to symbolize a struggle, and that's exactly what it is for 49% of Americans. So they can barely afford to live month to month, So if they burn the kitchen down, right, and there's like $10,000 worth of damages, they're not going to be able to pay that. I mean, they're just going to up and leave. They're going to disappear. You'll never see them again, and then you've got to fix your kitchen. So if you ask them to get renter's insurance and they do, then that will kick in and help with the damages. 2 to 3 fires happen every minute, and the average fire costs about $18,000. So I'm actually really curious if anybody has had a fire situation. Now I know that's an average, but if you had like a kitchen fire or a shed fire or a grill fire or a deck fire or whatever, go ahead and put in that question box just some of the numbers, right? Like how much did it actually cost you? I'm curious. Did it cost you like $100,000? Was it $5,000? You know, do you not even know because the insurance took care of it? Like I'm really curious. So I'll let that go for a minute. I'll come back to it. All right, so next, believe it or not, you have 3 to 10 gallons of hazardous material in your house at any given point. Now, this could be hazardous material that could injure a guest. This could be a hazardous material that would catch on fire for any given reason, and it could just cause damage to property, right? I mean, if it's acidic in any way, like we had a pool where I used to live, and the uric acid was just amazingly potent, and so not only would it knock you off, right? It would the smell of it was intense, but it would also eat into all the concrete it touched. So that's crazy. So hazardous material has the potential to do a variety of different types of damage to a property. You want to make sure that when that happens, that you're covered. The average water claim is about $7,000. So water, even more than fire, is one of the worst things to damage property because it just gets into everything. And you can't really put out water leak. Like you can spray water on fire, but you can't put fire on water. So it's a little harder to deal with. And I want you to know that if you live if your tenants live in an apartment complex and the apartment complex has, or the building has sprinklers, it's actually just a matter of time before somebody does have a small little tiny fire in their house or in their unit, and that triggers the sprinklers for a whole floor or a whole building even. And all of those people are now going to have really wet TVs and really wet carpet and really wet appliances. So, you know, water is crazy. Water, it'll put out the fire, but it'll kill everything else. Not kill, it'll affect everything else. The average loss of a burglary is about $2,300. Now, that seemed low to me. Actually, it's absolutely true, but that just seemed low to me. I was like, oh, they'll get in and, you know, steal everything. Well, I used to live next to a police officer, and he said that rarely do burglars ever go for everything. They want to get in and get out in like 5 minutes or less, and they're looking for high-priced jewelry. They're looking for, you know, light TVs. Nowadays, you can buy a 52-inch flat screen, and it weighs like 30 pounds, right? So they look for those things that they can carry really quickly, and that's laptops, tablets, cell phones, anything like that. And so it's a little bit less, but they're only carrying like 2 or 3 things out at a time. Now, moving on to the actual benefits for landlords. So we talked about like why it matters, right? Because those statistics are a little scary. I'm not trying to fearmonger you. I'm just saying they're real, right? And if anything, you're probably in your lifetime as a landlord, you're going to experience a fire at your property and you're going to experience water damage. So you need to really be prepared for that, and then you need tenants to be prepared for that. So let's talk a little bit more about the benefits for you as a landlord. One, if you require or if you tell your tenants to get renter's insurance and they do, it reduces the chance of a lawsuit. Now, I don't have any data on that necessarily, but walk this through with me. If they have a renter's insurance policy and they lose their bike, okay, then they are probably just going to go file a claim. That is the path of least resistance. But if they don't have any other options, they might sue you. They may not win, but they might sue you. And that's a hassle. It's a lot of stress. It's just not worth it. So generally speaking, tenants will take the path of least resistance when trying to solve a problem. And it's not just tenants. I think all people do. So if you give them an easy out, meaning renter's insurance, then that will be the path they take. It also reduces your responsibility for temporary housing. So if there's a kitchen fire and the place is now uninhabitable, then and they have renter's insurance, they can just go deal with it. They can just go, the loss of use coverage. They can just go like activate that and go stay somewhere and work it out. Especially if it's if they're liable for the damage because they left the stove on all night, that kind of stuff. Now I had a situation where I had two tenants. They were newlywed, or not newlyweds. They had an infant, so new parents, and they were first-time parents. They didn't know what they were doing. I mean, none of us did, but they were flushing regular diapers down the drain. They didn't know you had to buy a diaper genie. Like they just flushed them, right? Because that's where the stuff goes. Now you can imagine that it didn't take long for my sewer pipes to clog up. So shortly thereafter, it clogged up. There was nastiness in multiple places, and we didn't know what was going on. Like we had no idea, right? And they didn't even think twice about flushing diapers. So what they did is I was like, well, listen, that's your only bathroom. You can't use it, obviously. So now this place is uninhabitable because there's no restroom. So go stay in a hotel, and then we'll figure it out like as I do some more research. And when I had a plumber come in and he snaked the drain with a camera and he found a bunch of diapers, it was clear that it was now their responsibility, their fault, and their tenant's insurance policy covered the cost of the hotel. So because they were staying in a hotel, like a habitable dwelling during this entire thing, they were not obligated to a rent reduction. They just paid rent like normal, even though they weren't actually there the whole time. So that's a great example of how that plays to your favor. Now let's talk about how renter's insurance at the front end, when you're reviewing applicants, actually helps you kind of weed out applicants who are not financially stable or they might be over-exhausted. So for an example, if you have a couple tenants or applicants who have applied to your place and you say, hey, listen, I want you to get renter's insurance. I'm going to put it in the lease, provided that your state law allows for it. Put it in the lease and require it. And they come to you and they say, well, you know what, I just can't afford it. I don't want to do it. Like, it's just not my thing. And they're basically fighting over like $100 to $200, period. Like that's it. That's all it costs, right? Well, that maybe means that if they can't even afford to pay $100 to $200 in a year or for renter's insurance, then they might have trouble paying rent later down the road. So it's a good kind of litmus test for just financial stability. Now, it also can cover your deductible. So as a landlord, if a tenant burns the kitchen down, I keep using this example, if a tenant burns this kitchen down and you have to rebuild it and your homeowner's insurance kicks in to help you with that, because now it's like an actual property damage that they will help with. The renter's insurance, assuming that the insurance companies work it out, they will just help you or reimburse you for that deductible because it wasn't actually your fault, right? Assuming the tenant was liable. So that's kind of nice. A lot of times people will have $1,000 deductible. I think it goes down to even at like $250 is the lowest, but sometimes it's $1,000, and that's a lot that you shouldn't have to really pay for if you weren't at fault. But best of all, it gives you peace of mind. Now, I know that sounds hokey, but it's true. Like, if I know that my tenants have renter's insurance, and I know that if they do something silly that's going to cause me money or damage, that it's going to get taken care of. I'm not necessarily going to have to file a claim on my own policy. Their policy will kick in, and I'm just, it's going to be a hassle a little bit, but I'm going to sleep well, right? I'm not gonna stay up all night worrying about it. So, next step, what to really do about this? We've given you a lot of information. I see a lot of questions that have come in. I want to encourage you to look at your state laws and consider requiring renter's insurance for all of your tenants. Now, in many states, in most states, you can actually do that by putting in a lease, and you can actually say in there that this is a contract, this is an agreement, you agree to buy renter's insurance and show proof of that, and therefore I know that you're covered, right? If you put it in a lease in most states, that's okay. That's a legally binding document or contract. But in some states you can't, so make sure that you look at it. I know in Massachusetts, they have very strict laws on what you can force the tenant to pay for. And for example, you can't force a tenant to pay for a credit report. You have to pay for that. And so I think that's a little extreme, but the law is written in such a way that it would seem to restrict forcing renters insurance too. So again, not legal advice, but it's worth looking into. And then I also recommend that you, if you do require it, or if you can't require it by state law, recommending that you get, you would tell them to get $100,000 in liability coverage. That's really what you're most concerned about. Now I know that it's good for property, personal property for them, but like what you really care about is that liability coverage. So if they really wanted to, they could go out, find a policy, and just pay for liability, but that seems a little silly because it's not that much more money to get personal property coverage. So if you purchase renter's insurance through Cozy, they'll actually get $100,000 at a minimum of coverage, and they'll also get $15,000 in personal property coverage. So it's like the cherry on top. It's pretty neat.
Hi, Nicole here.
To make it super easy. Yes. Hey, Nicole.
Hey, just wanted to chime in. Requiring liability insurance is absolutely legal in all 50 states. It's requiring a personal property where it gets a little fuzzy, but in all 50 states you can require liability coverage without any problems.
Thank you. That's awesome. I didn't know that. That's great. So there you go. So you can put it in your lease. And then would you say, Nicole, that you actually can you do the same thing with personal property coverage, or is that recommended that you don't say anything necessarily about that in your lease?
That you would have to defer to state laws. I think the majority of states right now that's acceptable in, but I would have to look at each individual law to tell you if it's available in all 50 states. But liability, definitely.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, and it sounds a little weird to, like, silly almost to say, hey, I'm your landlord and I'm forcing you to cover your personal belongings. Like, it's kind of sad that people don't take that initiative themselves, because I have stuff and I want it to be covered. I'm as a renter, I want to make sure that my TV is going to be covered. So it seems silly that they don't do it themselves, but if you can require it in your state, go for it. And then lastly, you have to make it super easy to purchase, because we all will take the path of least resistance, and sometimes that path is not doing it. And you have to make it super easy. So I used to say, what I used to do was just like, just go get a policy, right? Well, then I started realizing the path of least resistance was call up your car insurance company if they had a car and say, I'd like to add renter's insurance, and I would tell my tenants to go do that, and sometimes they would do that, and it would be easier because they already had that relationship with that car insurance company. But then I realized, when we started offering through Cozy, it was so much easier, so much easier. So let me dive into that. So Cozy recently partnered with Assurant, which is where Nicole is from, and if you missed it in the beginning, she is actually in Florida right now on the call with us to give us advice and give us some insight. And she's sitting in her car doing this webinar with us because they don't have power from the hurricane. Like, she's down there right in the middle of it, and she's making it happen. So if that says anything about Assurant, she's down there, in the hurricane. So let's talk about Assurant real quick. Why did we partner with them, and why are they such a good company? So I want to tell you that Assurant is, first, an A-rated publicly traded company. It has 450 dedicated employees to their renters program, which is way more than most companies have, period. They employ their own adjusters. Now, if you've ever had to file a claim before and you get a third-party adjuster, you know that it is challenging because they just don't care. Now, Assurant has their own adjusters and their own people that are employees, not contractors, and they will take care of you. They're quick to respond to loss events. In many cases, they are oftentimes the first people on the site for major tragedies. So we were very impressed. Now, Cozy and Assurant for landlords, let's talk about that real quick. The reason we partnered is, one, now we can make it super easy for you to require or to at least offer this renter's insurance policy for your tenants through Cozy. So Cozy makes property management software. It just made sense for us to offer this as well. Not only that, we take it a step further, which nobody else does. We make it super easy for you to monitor it. So when your tenants have this insurance. They can buy it through Cozy, or they can even upload a copy of their existing policy if they have one, and you can monitor that. You'll have all the policy numbers, you'll have all the account numbers, it's fine. You'll have access to it. If they cancel their policy, you'll know about it. So that is the common complaint we hear from landlords. It's like, oh, they bought the policy for the first week and then showed it to me and then canceled it as soon as I checked it off my list. And it's free for you as a landlord. For tenants, it is super simple to enroll. It's just part of the process, so they walk through that to set up rent. They also just check a box and walk through the process to get insurance. It's guaranteed acceptance, so they're doing it at the same time when they're setting up everything else, when they're moving into your property, and they're guaranteed to be accepted, and they can take it with them. That's really key. So they get this policy. Even if they move out, they can take it with them to their next property, and it's super affordable. So the average is anywhere from $16 to $20 a month, and there's even a discount if the landlord requires it, and a discount if they buy an annual policy and pay for it all at once. So it's really cheap. This is an example. This is actually a screenshot of what you see in Cozy. So if you as a landlord are walking through the process of asking for them to pay rent, like they're getting ready to move into the system, and for those of you who use Cozy currently, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So you're walking through the system, and then you get to this screen, and it's like, the rent's this much, your security deposit this much, and now, like, do you require renter's insurance in your policy? And you just check a box, right? If you do, you check this box, and then we on the back end will ask the tenants when they're setting up the payments, like, hey, guess what? Your landlord says it's required. Do you want to buy a policy? We'll make it super easy, and you'll be done like that. So it's truly as easy as checking a checkbox for you as a landlord. And then if you do, they will get $100,000 in liability coverage. They'll get $15,000 in personal property coverage for all their stuff. And the deductible is really reasonable. It's $250. So that way, if they have a $500 bike and it gets stolen, they're not out of pocket $500 because the policy didn't kick in. It's actually really affordable, right? And they give you replacement cost coverage. So if you lose your iPad, you'll get a new iPad. Pretty simple. And then, like I said, $16 to $20 a month, so super affordable. Most tenants can spare $100 to $200, a year. This is an example of some silly characters, but I wanted to show you what it looks like in Cozy. So let's say this is your tenant list, your tenant directory for a particular property or lease, and you had 4 tenants in that lease or in that unit. And if you look at the upper right, let's see if I'm going to use this little pointer thing here. Yeah, right here. If you use, for Mr. Bob Ross, he went ahead and bought Assurance through Cozy, and you can see that he's verified. Now, Angela Lansbury did not buy anything. She's not done anything. It's just blank. Now, Larry Bird on the left is insured, and he put in his own information. So he had another policy from a different company, and that's fine. He just added in the information. And then this guy, the other Larry Bird, was invited to pay, does not have insurance, but has not set it up yet. So it lets you see exactly what the status is. Let me move forward. If you were to click on View Details for Bob Ross, you would then get this screen that tells you when the start date is, when the end date is, and what their policy number is. So if you ever had to make a claim against their policy, you would have all that information. So it's verifiable. If they go in and they cancel the policy, you'll know about it. You'll get to see it. You'll get an email. They can also get more coverage if they want. They don't have to just opt in for the 115,000 minimums. They can call up Assurant. They can work through that and increase it or add on other things like expensive jewelry and anything else that they need. They can customize it, but that's the base. That's the minimum. Now that's it, guys. I tried to stick true to about 45 minutes, and now I know we have a lot of questions that come through. So I want to be respectful of your time. Let's go ahead and dive into some questions about this. So Maggie, if you have any queued up, go ahead and rattle it off to Nicole.
All right. So we have a number of questions, and they tend to be in similar groups. So I'm going to group the questions together. The first question comes around how to ensure the tenant has enough coverage. So against perils, and then just your recommendation on a minimum coverage to require in your lease.
Yeah, so my recommendation for minimum coverage is $100,000 liability and $15,000 personal property. So certainly you need that liability to be high. Don't let them get away with, like 10 grand for liability, because that's not going to cover a broken arm. But $100,000 will cover a damaged kitchen. It'll replace a fence. It'll help with medical. That's my recommendation. Now they're completely allowed and able to call up the insurance company once they get the policy and change it. That's super easy. So, Nicole, did you have anything to add to that?
No, the only thing I would say is, once they go ahead and purchase the insurance through Cozy, the $100,000 and the $15,000 personal property, they can always go ahead and go through our website or call our customer service to increase that. Maybe they want $20,000 or $30,000 for the personal property. That can be adjusted, and they can always add endorsements on or schedule really expensive items.
Perfect. Yeah.
Great question. All right, next up, when does renter's insurance subrogate against the homeowners and hit the landlord's policy too?
That's a tricky one, because it's certainly going to be case by case, and it certainly is going to depend on how much liability the tenant has. Nicole, if you heard that question, do you care to comment on that one?
I mean, it's really hard to generalize. If it breaks $100,000, for example, it is $200,000 or $300,000 worth of damage, which we don't see very often, or it's not. I shouldn't say that. I should say that it's not common that renters cause that damage. There is that possibility, but everything's done on a case-by-case basis.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because certainly if we maxed out the renter's policy and it went over the $100,000 liability that they had, then that's certainly when the homeowners or the landlord policy would kick in for sure. Certainly after that, but anything below that would certainly depend on liability, like who's liable for it.
All right. We have had a lot of questions on flooding. So would the landlord, one, would the renter's insurance cover flooding? Two, if renter's insurance doesn't cover flooding, would the homeowner's flood insurance cover the tenant's belongings?
Nicole?
So currently, our policies do not cover flood. Renter's insurance typically does not. I unfortunately can't speak to the homeowner's insurance as to whether their flood policy would kick in. I think that would completely depend on whether that was an act of nature or tenant negligence, etc. I would definitely tell people to go ahead and look at that. But renters do have the option of purchasing their own flood insurance if they wish.
Right, and to add to that, to support that, I have never, ever seen a renter's policy that does have flood insurance built in. So it's always something extra, and even for the homeowner themselves, it's always an extra rider. So you'd have to talk to your own insurance company about that rider and see what their policy is on tenant damage. But if it's truly just a flood, that has nothing to do with the tenant, then your homeowner's policy would, or your landlord policy would deal with it if you had the right coverage.
All right, next question is a purchasing question. Can landlords purchase renter's insurance in general for their tenants? And if possible, can you do that through Cozy and Assurant?
So it's not common because it doesn't scale well. So somebody with 100 units is not going to want to pay for a renter's insurance policy for all of their tenants because it gets very expensive. And it's not possible in Cozy. So what we have heard, or what we've seen, is that if a landlord does want to reimburse a tenant for it, then they can just reimburse them the money. They can do that through Cozy. They can just add a credit. So essentially, the tenant pays for it as part of that process. And we've streamlined it. We really wanted to make this process super easy to get, or this policy super easy to get. So they just kind of walk the process in like 5 minutes or less, and they're setting up rent and buying renter's insurance, and they're done. If you as a landlord wanted to pay them for that policy, you can issue a credit in Cozy, and that will go on their lease ledger, and they can claim that credit or pay less next month or whatever. So you could do that. I have heard of some apartment owners doing like just a umbrella liability coverage, I think it's what it's called, but it's essentially it covers all the tenant's liability, but it's also very expensive. And I just, on principle, I think the tenant should pay for it because they get personal property coverage, and that's important and valuable to them.
So I'm going to chime in here. Landlords cannot purchase renter's insurance because the renter's insurance is a tenant-owned policy. And so really what they are protecting is they're protecting themselves. So when you think of renter's insurance, the most important thing to think about is that the renter is covering themselves against any damage that they would, accidentally do to your unit. And so this would be something that they would inevitably be charged back for. So it's not something that I would necessarily encourage crediting for or trying to purchase for them. It's more about requiring it in your lease and making it common practice to have your residents insure both the possibility of negligence as well as their personal belongings. Yeah,
I'm glad you said that. And if you have current tenants in Cozy, and this feature was just rolled out, so they were never prompted to buy renter's insurance, you can actually tell them to go back and purchase it. It's something that they can add on later, even if it isn't required in your lease or you never, talk to them about it. You can do so. I mean, it truly is a value to them, and if they want it, it's really affordable, and they can just go in and do it at any time.
All right, next question is on the tenant side of things. Do they have to have receipts and itemize all of the things they want covered for potential issues in the future and potential claims? And how do they place value on things? Do things get, if they buy a couch that's $2,000 in a couple of years, is it worth less than that? So kind of best practices for helping your tenants take advantage of the renter's insurance should they need it.
Okay, Nicole?
Receipts are always really, really helpful. When we're coming to best practices, the best idea is to go ahead and take pictures of your belongings and have them on hand. If they have receipts, that's wonderful. Taking a videotape of the apartment to kind of see what's there, and then going ahead and remember, we do replacement costs. So, if they lose their laptop, or not lose, if it's stolen out of the apartment, then we'll go ahead and replace that with a new one.
Gotcha. The next question is, what is the difference between damage insurance and rental insurance?
Good question. So damage insurance is typically what the owner buys. That is damage against the property itself. And maybe your belongings like your appliances, if you had furniture in there, against damage like fire, water, and smoke, and all the things we talked about. Renter's policy has liability coverage in it, which also has a damage aspect to it, but it's renter's policy covers a tenant and their stuff and anything that they're responsible for when they're negligent, and a damage policy for the homeowner for a rental, or for the landlord and his rental, covers the actual dwelling, the property, any damage that happens to that above and beyond what a renter's policy would cover in negligent situations. Did that match up with your definition, Nicole?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Cool.
All right. Water damage and floods is a very popular topic, so we have a bunch of follow-up questions. The first is, will water damage from a leaking roof due to heavy rains be covered? Is that different than flooding? And then when it comes to flooding, is that just active nature flooding, or is that, your plumbing breaks and it floods the entire kitchen? So if we could do a little bit of a deeper dive into flooding and what's covered and what's not, I think that would be really helpful.
So let's break that down for a minute for Nicole. So Nicole, let's take that step by step. So in the case of a leaky roof, right, what would happen there?
If it's just a basic leaky roof and that goes ahead and enters into the apartment, that would not be covered because that's considered normal wear and tear, and typically that would be the landlord's responsibility. Okay. Now, say that there is a water heater and it explodes, and the result is flooding of the apartment and damage. That would be covered because that's caused by explosion. And then if it's just natural flooding, again, we touched on it a little bit before, but unfortunately that's something that is not covered unless you have a separate flood insurance rider.
Gotcha. So obviously the repair to the roof itself is not something that the tenant or the tenant's policy would cover, but what about that leaky roof, water damage that fell all over a bunch of electronics that the tenant had insured? Would that be covered?
It would not. And the reason being is when you're thinking of a renter's insurance policy, the best thing to think about is negligence. So we cover, insurance for the renter covers 4 basic things. It covers, theft or burglary. It covers explosion, wind, and smoke, and all of those caused by negligence on the behalf of the tenant.
Gotcha. Okay, great.
All right, next question. What if the renter has renter's insurance, but they prefer not to use it to have their premiums go up?
Well, that's why we give you their policy number. So if truly they're negligent on something and they are responsible for it, that's why you need a copy of their policy and their declaration so you know what their policy number is. I mean, you're allowed to file a claim against someone else's insurance, and then they hash it out with the owner of that policy to figure out what really happened. So if you don't have their information, then you wouldn't be able to file a claim against it. So that's why.
Also, yep, and with Assurant, the landlord can always go ahead and file a claim on behalf of the tenant. And so that's something that is, really, really important, so you have that ability.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly why we make it super easy for you to find that policy number.
All right, next question. Does either the landlord's or renter's insurance policy cover bed bug damage?
Ooh, good one. Nicole?
Currently, it does not in the renter's insurance policy. Right now, it does cover it, I should say, in California, but that is the only place where it currently is covered.
Right, and California has, they're usually on the forefront of laws like that, and so bed bugs, they've been around a long time, but the big invasion of bed bugs has really been something that's only really happened in the last 5 years or so, and so states have been a little slow to address it legally, but California was not, so for sure. What else?
All right, next question. How do you handle mandatory city evacuations like hurricanes, wildfires? Do the landlords owe your tenant something because the tenant has a loss of use of that rental property?
Since you're down in Florida, can you address that?
So if there's mandatory evacuations, you know what? That's something I would have to look into if it counts. If it's uninhabitable, then I believe that loss of use would kick in. So yes, yeah. If it's currently uninhabitable, then the loss of use would work.
Okay, cool. Well, no, that's great. So if Nicole's going to look that one up in the case of like if the unit's certainly inhabitable, but they're forced to leave due to mandatory evacuation. I don't know if we've ever had that question before. That's a good one. So we'll look that up, and for the person who asked it, we'll get back to you.
All right. Next question is, does the landlord need to be listed as the beneficiary of the renter's insurance when the tenant buys a policy?
Nicole, is that the right term, beneficiary?
So what we typically recommend is that the landlord is listed as the interested party.
Right.
one thing to look out for is you never want to be listed as an additional insured, and the reason being is you can never put a claim on yourself. So an interested party means that you get notifications and you're listed on that policy as interested, but you're not insuring yourself.
Right. And another reason why to enforce getting renter's insurance through Cozy in that process is that you are instantly listed as an interested party. You don't have to do that extra step. It's already built in.
All right, next question. A couple landlords have asked if there's a situation where the damage caused to the rental or some issue has caused the tenant to move out early and the landlord has lost income based on the tenant moving out. Does the renter's insurance cover situations like that? Like lost income from a rental property from the tenant breaking a lease?
I don't believe so. Nicole?
That would be a case by case. It's possible, but it depends on the specific nature of the circumstances.
Yeah, and if you have a landlord policy on your property, and then most landlord policies have something called fair market rent replacement, and that is essentially if something happens where the place is not inhabitable and you are no longer able to get rent from that property because of the damage, then they will reimburse you, sometimes up to 6 months if it goes that long, of the rent that you would have received or the fair market rent for that property. So I've seen that where the landlords reimburse the rent that they miss out on through their home insurance policy, but I've not come across it where it's covered by the rental policy, but we can look that up as well.
All right, a few landlords have asked, there's a minimum that you can require in your lease, but can your tenants opt by a greater policy coverage, and what does that look like?
They not in the system, so they can't opt in for more coverage at the time of purchase. We wanted to make it super easy because we found that if we started adding more options, they would sometimes just bail out. They wouldn't do it. I wouldn't have anything. So we wanted to make sure they were covered at the minimum level, and then if you wanted them to get more, if that's what's required in your lease, they can always contact Assurant or log in or whatever through Assurant and just increase the coverage, and then they make up the difference in cost. So that's actually very easy. But in that initial run through, they're just offered the minimum.
All right, some policy coverage questions. If a tenant is trimming her bushes and snips the copper wire to the AC unit, would that be covered?
Sounds like a real story.
Yeah, very specific.
Well, that would be negligent. I mean, that would be the same as running a lawnmower into a fence, right? I mean, they're doing something and they accidentally cut something that caused damage. So I would suppose it would be covered.
All right. How about dog bites? Are those covered?
Yes. Now, I will say that there's guaranteed coverage, but you should, if you do have a pet, especially a dog, especially breeds that potentially could be restricted, you would want to tell the insurance company about that. If you do not let them know that you have a dog and then you have an incident, it could cause problems for you. What do you think, Nicole?
So actually at Assurant, we cover all pets, regardless of breed or size or anything of that nature. So we have no restrictions whatsoever. If you have a Rottweiler or a Pit Bull or any of those awesome breeds that are considered, more dangerous, it's totally fine. We will still cover that.
That's awesome. I want to pause for a second. That is so rare. I've dealt with almost every insurance company out there through all of my tenants and them getting policies, and it was always the same stuff that we aren't quite sure if pets are covered because of these breed restrictions, and it's a half breed and all this. That is amazing. And in fact, I had a tenant who did have a pit bull, and because of the pit bull, his policy was going to be about $180 a year, but because of that pit bull, it was $400 a year. So they covered them. It was just a whole lot more, but that is not the case here. So that's
what's great is they are totally covered, and you don't have to worry about any of that.
That's amazing. Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right, next question is about requiring renter's insurance in your rental agreement and leases. One, where can you find renter's insurance verbiage that might help you write your leases?
Mm-hmm.
And is that even allowed? Can you do that?
Yes, in all 50 states, you can require liability renter's insurance. So we aren't going to give you a clause to put in your lease because that would be technically giving legal advice. But what you can do, and this is super easy, just go to a legal forms website, one that has legal forms for your state, and you can get one of those there. You can get a clause for like a pet addendum or a pet insurance addendum, or even just a simple paragraph you can include in your lease. If you need a recommendation on where to go, check out landlordology.com/resources, and you'll see a list of a bunch of legal websites where you can go to get that stuff. Did you have any comments on that, Nicole?
The only other site that might be something to look at would be the NAA site. That they might be able to go ahead and look for samples there just to kind of get an idea.
Yeah, the National Apartment Association, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they may. I know they have a lot of stuff behind a login, but they might have a bunch of. Hopefully, that's something that's free. So it's not hard to find an applicable clause for that.
All right, and a follow-up question a couple of people had: can you require specifically that it's through Assurant?
I don't. Okay, good.
I'll take that. No. You cannot require that it goes through a specific, company. You can only require the insurance, which is why Cozy opted to not only allow you to buy through Cozy, through Assurance, but also to go ahead if you have an outside insurance, policy, or decide to go elsewhere, that they can go ahead, the resident can go ahead and enter that outside information.
Right, exactly. So you can do both of those in Cozy, or at least the tenant can do both of those in Cozy. And I wouldn't recommend, just from a principle standpoint, that you require one company over another, simply because you will have tenants or applicants that come into your life that already have a policy, and they're happy with it. They've been paying it. They've got it set up on autopay. Like, it works for them, and it probably meets your requirements. So just from a customer service standpoint, it makes sense to let them just continue to keep what they have. Don't wake the sleeping dragon there, And so you just want to know what that policy number is, and they can upload all that information into Cozy, and you'll see it.
All right. Do tenants need to qualify for renter's insurance?
Sometimes, but not with us. So it's guaranteed acceptance. We ask a few questions during that process, but it is guaranteed acceptance. So I can't speak for other companies, but not through Cozy and Assurant.
And the one thing I'd like to point out is it's not based on credit, which a lot of companies are.
That is true. When I went to get a renter's policy a couple of years ago, they ran my credit and not only dinged my credit score, but then jacked up my rate, even though I had a score of over 800. So I did not end up going with them because I didn't like them. But that's Assurant's not going to do that. So we're not going to do that to you.
All right, next question. What do you suggest for tenants who are already on their lease? You didn't require renter's insurance. What do you do, and what can you do next year?
Great question. So I'll repeat. So if you did not require renter's insurance in your lease, can you force them to get renter's insurance? The answer is no. You cannot. So if it's not in your lease, then you can't make anybody do anything they didn't agree to. That's what the lease is for. So the best bet you can do right now is just say, hey, listen, there's now renter's insurance in Cozy, and you can log in and look for it there right in your lease section, and say it's a really good thing and it's really affordable. Like, get it if you want to. I'd strongly recommend that you do, but obviously it's not required. And if the tenant is smart, they're going to cover their stuff. I mean, that's just common sense. So that's what I would suggest. And then next time you have a lease that's renewing or changing, that's the time to add it in. So that's when I would add in that statement and make them sign that new lease agreement. If you have a month-to-month agreement with the tenant, you can change it, next month. So that's pretty quick. So that's what I would do.
All right. A few questions about roommates. Does one roommate's policy cover another roommate's? If they're not insured, can you get multiple roommates on the same policy? How do you handle a bunch of adults who aren't related living in the same house renting from you?
Yeah. Nicole, would you care to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So for one Assurant policy, you can list 2 people on that policy. So 2 roommates per policy can be listed. So what happens when you have 3 living in there? What we typically recommend is, at least 2 policies then. Because let's say the roommate A and roommate B are having a party and, C is out of town. C is the only one that's covering, the only one that is, covered. That's not going to cover all of the damage into the apartment.
Right. And with a $15,000 personal property, coverage or $100,000 liability, the more people you add, the greater potential there is for those damages. So you want to make sure that coverage, there's enough coverage there. So that's another reason why it's restricted to 2. But that will cover, 2 people will cover, spouse situations very easily, and most roommate situations are 2. It's the number that we see a lot of. So.
I might just chime in and say that relatives are covered. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's great. So if it's a family, then it's only one policy you need, and they're all covered.
Correct. Your spouse and adult children living in the home would be covered.
Right.
How would you handle pet damaging floors?
Oh, like Fido, who never got his nails.
Scratching, restroom on the floor, bad smells. What do you do?
So, Nicole, what happens when the dog causes $10,000 in hardwood damage?
Unfortunately, that is not a peril that is covered. While we cover the dog liability for any dog bites, pet damage to the apartment would need to be covered by their security deposit.
Yep. And when the security deposit isn't enough, I wonder if that's something that perhaps the landlord policy might cover. More often than not, I'll just say this, in that type of situation, you're better off just going after the tenant for that damage. You certainly don't want to file that kind of claim with a landlord policy because you're filing a claim against your policy. But you're probably better off going to small claims court, with the tenant and winning a judgment for that. That's honestly what I would do in that situation.
All right. And how about cigarette burns to carpets or floors? Is that same as pets, or is that different?
Well, cigarette burns, no. I mean, fire, yes. Fire, if your carpet catches on fire, sure. Cigarette burns, that's there's a security deposit for a reason. And carpet damage, is likely, going to be covered by that deposit. And that's absolutely why you should take a deposit. So I think the deeper question here is, do I need to collect a deposit? And the answer is always yes. So it's ridiculous if you don't. Renter's insurance is not meant to be a replacement for a security deposit. There's something else. There's another product on the market called deposit insurance, and that is it can be valuable to large asset apartment communities where they just pay for this and then they don't collect a deposit. They're essentially filing claims every other week, but that the economics on that are vastly different. So you don't think that this is a replacement for your security deposit, and it shouldn't be. It's to cover their belongings and their negligence, and that's it.
All right. Here's a few Cozy specific questions. So if you are a landlord collecting rent through Cozy, there's a few people who said they couldn't see the page you saw. Can you walk us through the flow of kind of how you require renter's insurance for maybe tenants who already are set up to pay rent through Cozy.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can go into that a little more.
Yeah, I'm not going to walk through the demo real quick. Maggie does a demo once a week for Cozy that walks through some of those pages. So, and we're running low on time. But yes, so if you were to create a new payment schedule in Cozy or a new lease and schedule where you're asking tenants to pay, one of the screens in there is just simply renter's insurance, and there's a little description and a checkbox. It's really that simple. So it is tied to the payment setup because that is when tenants are in the system getting payments set up for the first time, and that's when we collect money from them. And it made sense to also authorize a purchase of a policy. So that's where you'll see it. Go check it out. It's under the payments tab, and then you can create a new payment system or payment setup. And you'll see it there. So if you had set up a lease prior to the launch of this product, you wouldn't have seen it. So that may be where some of the confusion is happening. In the future, we're actually just going to make it really easy for a tenant to buy renter's insurance in Cozy, even if they aren't on a lease with you or any landlord. Maybe they're between places. That's going to be super easy too. So that's down the road, but for now, it's just under payments.
All right. What happens if the renter cancels their renter's insurance mid-lease? What do you do? Yep. How do you address that?
Well, we have a system where we work through an API that talks to an Assurance system, and if a policy is canceled, we actually get a report of that daily, and then that will actually notify, set up some triggers and notify you that it's been canceled. So right now you can log in, you can see that it's canceled, but you'll get notified in the near future. Those automatic notifications will come too. So that's one of the big reasons why you would want to use a tool like Cozy to enforce renter's insurance, because there's no other system out there that's going to let you know when the tenants cancel their policy. It's just, it's none of your business really, because it's a policy between the tenant and the insurer, but it kind of is your business, and that's why Cozy's here.
All right, we touched a little bit about this on the security deposit question, but what about intentional damage? If a renter punches up the hole in the wall intentionally or writes with marker, what is covered there, if anything?
Yeah, I know that vandalism and mischief is covered. Nicole, did you want to talk about that?
So again, the point of renter's insurance is to cover a renter's negligence. Right. So while if they left something on the stove and there was a kitchen fire, that would be covered. If they intentionally caused damage to the unit, then that would not be covered. Same with your, policy. Intentional damage is just not something that insurance generally will cover.
Insurance as a whole is really meant to cover accidents, point blank, and that's the definition of insurance, right? So yeah, again, you don't want to replace. This is not a replacement for a security deposit. And if your tenant didn't maliciously spray paint words all over the walls, I mean that's just plain out property damage. You file a police report. You take that tenant to court, and you get a judgment for it. I mean it's criminal, or maybe not criminal. They're not going to go to jail necessarily, but it's certainly property damage.
All right, a few questions about if your tenant cancels renter's insurance and you have it in your lease, can you evict them?
Well, if it's a lease clause, like if you have it as a requirement in their lease, then not having it would be a lease violation. So you would send a standard notice of a lease violation to them. Now that notice usually has to be sent a certain number of days before it kind of takes effect. And that number of days varies by state. So, it could be 3 days, could be 24 hours notice, it could be 7 days. I forget what state it is, Massachusetts, maybe it's like 30 days. So there's a period of time where that tenant has an opportunity to fix the problem. And in this case, you send them a notice and you say, if you don't buy renter's insurance like your lease requires, then I'm going to terminate your lease. Then they'd have a certain amount of time to go buy renter's insurance. So it's really that simple. If they didn't, then you could terminate the lease for that, in the same way that you could terminate the lease for any other violation that they didn't fix. And then they would leave, and if they didn't leave, you'd go down the road of eviction if you needed to.
Is there any on-site inspections required for renter's insurance?
Nope.
All right, that was easy.
Let's take a few more.
Yeah.
No more than 5 more minutes.
All right. Yeah, thanks for everyone for sticking with you, and the questions are so good. So let me queue up another one. If insurance premiums go unpaid, can the landlord pick up delinquent payments to maintain coverage?
Again, the policy is between the tenant and the insurer. So the tenant is the customer and the insurance company is the insurer, and that's their relationship. So I'm pretty sure the answer is no. Nicole?
The answer is no.
Yeah. Yeah. And while you're looking up another question, I wanted to bring up, I didn't mention this earlier, but in the right sidebar there's the GoToWebinar control panel, and at the bottom there's a bunch of handouts. So if you want to learn more about our partnership, or not necessarily about our partnership, but about Assurant, who is our provider of the insurance policies, there's a bunch of handouts in there that you can just open up, download, and read at your own will. So check those out. It's a little bit of a summary of what we talked about today. It goes into way more detail and probably answers a lot of these questions too. So, all right.
How do you handle a tenant who refuses to contact their carrier to file a claim? I think you touched on this earlier, but
that is why it's so important for you to make sure that you have what's called the declaration, or the first page, or the summary document of their policy. So you can require renter's insurance, but if you don't know who that insurer is and what their policy number is, it's going to be very hard for you to file a claim. So if they're hiding that information from you, shame on them, but also shame on you for not getting the information as the proof that you needed that they actually had the policy. So that's why Cozy requires, if you buy it through Cozy, you automatically get all that information. But there's also a space for, if they have their own policy already, they can just upload a copy of that information and insert their policy number. So you need to make sure you get that and keep that on file somewhere.
Does having renters insurance or tenants who are insured with renters insurance reduce your landlord's insurance?
That is interesting. That depends on your insurer. So I have seen insurance carriers that do say, if you require this in your lease, we will actually reduce your premium. I can't give you names, and you'll just have to call them and ask. Nicole, does Assurant have policies for landlords, and if so, is that something that happens?
We do not. Assurant focuses primarily on the tenants, risk mitigation, not the landlords.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. But call your insurance company and just ask. That's a great question. So I know that if you require it in the lease, I know that Assurant reduces the price for the tenant. So there's certainly a benefit for them. So it's worth asking.
All right. Next question. What happens if you furnish the units, like corporate leasing? It's your stuff, and it's damaged by negligence.
Well, your belongings, your furniture and appliances and things like that are going to be covered in your homeowner's or your landlord's policy. So you want to make sure that you're covered there. If there's a negligent issue here, if the tenant, if it's their fault and they burn all your furniture down, then that's a liability claim against them, not necessarily a personal property. That's your personal property, but a liability claim against them. Again, if there's no negligence there, then you would just file it on your own policy.
All right.
But if there is negligence if there is negligence on behalf of the tenant, that would be covered under the liability section.
Right. So it like most of these answers, it depends on the situation.
All right. One more question?
One more.
All right. Does Assurant rate renters? Do prior claims from that tenant matter? Are they tied to their social security number for you to track over time?
Nicole?
So a few things there. We do not track according to your Social Security number, and we don't credit rate. If renter's insurance is required, then your tenant will automatically be accepted and will automatically have a policy.
Yep, that's so key. That's so great, because a lot of times that's a risk. So if you require it through Cozy or in your lease and then check that box in Cozy, you know that your tenants are going to be accepted. So the only thing you have left to worry about is for them to pay for it. And they may not like that, but it's really affordable. Honestly, I've seen policies way more expensive than this. So, all right, I think that's it. So thank you. If we did not get to your question, I'm so sorry. We'll take a look at it and see what we can do. But Nicole, thank you for attending from Florida amidst the hurricane and all the damage that's there. And thank you for going to your car when none of the buildings had power. And Maggie, thank you for thank you for hosting these questions. Again, I'm Lucas Hall, and we're here, and we offer Cozy and insurance now. So if you have questions, you can go to those URLs that are on the page right now, cozy.co. There's even a page specifically designed to answer all your insurance questions. And then there's AssurantRenters.com, which is Assurant's dedicated site. They have a really great site that has a bunch of FAQs on it, which I've actually found very, very, very helpful. So check all those URLs out and grab the handouts for a few more minutes there. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll be in touch with this recording. So again, good night.